Well, hello everyone, Andy Spoons here. I hope this finds you well. So I just got a pretty cool message from an arborist friend of mine this morning saying that he had some cherry on hand, and he was not kidding. I'm so excited to get into some of this. So yeah, let's get some of it out of the car, and maybe we'll parcel into a big piece and see if we can crack out a cooking spoon or something like that. So here is my Silky Katanaboy. It's a 500mm saw. Actually not going to use, I don't often like using gloves for anything, to be honest. It's just when I'm holding really wet timber that I do. But once I get to the tools, I feel that gloves can get in the way of just feeling your work. So let's see if this catches, and we'll see how we go. So yeah, it's quite a large saw, as you can see. Once I get it started, then I'll switch to two hands and I'll see if it starts to grip and pull towards me. We might have to change tactics. I might want to, kind of put my foot in a spot, but I think we should be okay. Yeah, it's moving for sure. Almost there. Here we go. Oh, doesn't get much cleaner than that. Perfect. So here are the tools that I'm using for splitting. Got my Froe, my Svante Djarv Froe. I've got my axe, my silky saw. This is a Fadir Forge 860 gram carver, Silky Bigboy, and then my small Drawknife from Magnus Sundelin. But yeah, let's split this stuff open. So it is tough stuff. But to make my life easier, I'm just going to split off the bark, and I'll show you how effective that is. So that's going to be my line. So I'll literally just make some marks through here, because often the bark can be the reason that you're binding. It can really, really, really hold the wood together, especially with fruit wood. So one side, and then we'll just do the same over here. I think you're going to be surprised with how big a difference that's going to make. There we go. When it goes, it really goes. So you can see there's obviously a twist in the wood, and we're going to see where that wants to go when I pry this up. So the idea behind a Froe is that there's this leverage that you get from that twist, and then you can just drive on down and twist a bit more. There we go. Yeah, that's going to do it. I think it's going to want to twist, but let's see. Oh, that's not bad. That's quite good actually. So yeah, that played in my favor. The bark held it all together, but you can see you've got this beautiful two-tone going on right here. There are some knots that will give me grief, but I'm super happy with the color of this. First thing I'm going to do is just flatten out my angles. And I'm just constantly looking for twists, shakes in the wood, all of the things that might give me some grief in the future. I do love fresh cherry quite a lot. If you can get your hands on it, I highly recommend it. And while I'm carving, I'm looking for where my bowl is going to be, orientation in the wood. Quite often, the wood's going to tell you where it wants to be. And from what I can see here, you know, it's wider down there, narrower up here. This is probably going to be my bowl end. There's a knot here that I just want to get under. See how deep that goes. That might change my decisions. Maybe. I'm not ready to let go of it yet. Maybe I might have to. No, let's soldier on. I think I'm going to be lucky. Maybe. Let's just the other thing to bear in mind as well is while this line looks beautiful, and it is, these are going to carve differently, the sapwood and the heartwood. Heartwood's going to feel a little more like clay, and the sapwood is going to give you a little bit more resistance. It'll potentially tear more, so when you're putting both of them in the same piece, just be mindful that, you know, when you're carving on one side of the handle to the next, brace yourself for some differences, because it is going to be different. Okay, we're getting somewhere. I'm starting to flatten things out. And leaning towards where the front of the spoon will be, and let's just get into it. So you can see I've created a bottom side. I'm just going to saw down. It's going to be a serving spoon at this point, I think, just because of the size. Yeah, don't really want to get too close to that knot if I don't have to. Let's just do this. And I do all of this by eye. I have talked about dimensions, spoon dimensions on other videos that I've, you know, highly recommend checking out. But it honestly just gets down to what feels good. That feels good to me. And so that's where it's going to be. So that's my lowest point, my lowest section of the crank. Yeah, starting to come together. So I'm still axing through that knot just to see where it's going to come up, and I think we're going to be able to dodge it at the top. I think. Let's draw up a design. So it looks like, to me, I don't want to get any further up. I hope you can see this okay. That's going to be my top. You can see a knot through here, so that's going to be my bottom. Definitely a serving spoon size now. And then my center line will end up. One thing that you also need to keep in mind is when you're carving, the grain can often throw your center line off. And what I mean by that is this is all off to one side of my center line. So when you're carving, you might feel like everything is slightly askew. I'm just trying to maximize my amount of material here. And it means coming across into the heartwood a little bit more, which I don't mind. And then I'm going to do a big flat serving spoon, simply because I feel like it. The perks of doing freehand is you can just do what you feel. There's no real method to this outside of repetition, to be quite honest. Again, I've mentioned dimensions in other videos, so I definitely recommend checking that out, because there's always a foundation to, you know, this kind of creativity where you're just kind of feeling it. There are certain dimensions that make sense more than others, and your eye just starts to get used to seeing certain things. So there's a little tear out in here that I want to make sure doesn't throw off my spoon, so I might actually make it a bit wider than I usually do, just to make sure that I don't again get off center because of that grain. But anyway, that is the serving spoon shape. I'm dodging the knot right here, so that's why it's a little bit smaller. Otherwise I'd, you know, certainly try and maximize the edges, but I think that's fine. So we'll do some saw cuts. Okay. So like I mentioned before with the grain difference, what will happen here is as I'm axing, this side will likely pop off, this side will likely stick. What I mean by that is I'm imagining when I do a bump cut, I think this is going to be a bit more dynamic. It's kind of chipping and there we go, popping. Whereas the other side, I think is going to be a bit spongier. So what I might do is just make some light stop cuts before I do that. Just to give the wood somewhere to run. There we go. Yeah, so you can see I need to pry this side away, whereas the other side was a lot more forgiving. There we go. Be really mindful of not bumping your axe into the back of the bowl. So there's that knot. And I think it is going to be a part of, it's going to be a part of the spoon, whether we like it or not. So I might need to adjust my design a little bit, just a bit. Because you can see it's wanting to pop off there a little bit, which isn't ideal, but that's okay. Okay, and then honestly, because I'm here with the Drawknife, the rest of this is easy enough to do with the Drawknife. So I'll just axe out the back a little bit more, and then we can leave the rest for the Drawknife. Yeah, so there we go. You can kind of begin to finesse things with the Drawknife a little bit. I'm also looking at the top of this knot and I'm really not liking what I see. So what I think I might end up doing, unfortunately, is I might have to make a smaller spoon out of this. I think that's what I'm going to do, because you know what? That knot will end up driving me crazy. So we are going to redesign our spoon, and it's going to be a pretty aggressive redesign, to be honest, which I'm not a huge fan of, but that's okay. Basically, just this is why I've left a bit of meat on my drawing, because I'm going to essentially move everything off to one side so that I can get away from that knot. And proportionately, I need to drop the nose back a little bit. This is a good example of perseverance. And it is comical how large a piece I started, though. I'll be the first to admit that. I'll be the first to admit that. But I think this is going to be really nice. Lovely little eating spoon. Starting to get our shape back. And the rest of that I can do with the knife very, very easily. Here's a tip. I was a bit quiet there for a while. I hope you're still with me. I think what can happen is once you start getting into these smaller cuts, your mind wanders, you're constantly looking, constantly checking. Something worth mentioning is make sure that if there are some divots or flat spots that you don't want, always carve down to them. And don't think that you'll be able to get to them later, because you won't. What'll happen is, you'll work down from the top view, you'll try and come back, and you'll basically be out of wood. So what I like to do is make sure that if there's anything that's a little bit too flat, that I can basically get down to it. And then what I can do is, once I've evened it all out, I can work up on the edges. I can work up along this edge and then create more of a bowl at that point. But if you basically try and hold on to as much bowl as you can, what you'll end up doing is you'll just have flat spots on the bottom of your spoon, which isn't always the nicest for your mouth, especially for an eating spoon. If you're doing something like a serving spoon or a spatula or something like that, totally fine. But for something that's going to be in your mouth, it's nice to make sure that you've gotten rid of any inconsistencies. Okay, so we're starting to get there pretty nicely. Starting to feel like an eating spoon now. I'm going to work down the top profile at a 45-ish degree angle, not quite 45. I'd say maybe more 40-degree angle, shall we say. Again, just getting below any of those larger tool marks, because that's going to be your main pain at a later date. Is if you leave an axe mark or a Drawknife mark or something heavier on here, you can't put the wood back on. It's a subtractive craft. You're only taking things off. So I like to make sure that I've gone down below any of the tool marks, even on the bowl, because I know that I'm going to end up carving this bowl out, but I want to make sure that when I start, I'm starting from a really nice position. And my angles feel good. So, and often carving down in can give you an idea of any inconsistencies on the sides of your spoon as well. Which in this right here where I'm carving, that was where that knot still is. So yeah, if I'd tried to keep a hold of that, it would have been an absolute nightmare, and I just would have ended up not having anything to show for it. So while this is a comically different size spoon than what I had intended, it's still going to be a really lovely little eater. Just checking my symmetry on these shoulders. Certainly something that I've always found challenging. I don't think I'm alone in that. Okay, and just developing a little bit of a flow. I've got quite a chunky back of the handle, which is nice because it means I can create more of a dip, which is what I'm going to try and do right now. So just this is a personal design preference, you don't have to do this, but I enjoy a hard shoulder. So again, kind of swooping in here and getting a hold of that curve, and then bringing it down right in, and then trying to match that on the other side, and bringing it down. And working in thirds always makes your life a little easier, because I've done either side and now I can come down the middle. You could do all of this in one go, but what I find is if you put too much pressure on something that has to swoop, you'll end up popping out the wood grain or tearing. So it's nice to do it in thirds. It increases your chances of really gaining that curve, that nice curve. And I don't often like my eating spoons to be too curvy, because at the end of the day, if it's too curvy, then it's an odd angle for it to get to your mouth. I like a curve here to sit in the thumb. I like a curve here to sit under the finger. And then I like the shoulder to not be too pronounced, so that it sits in, you know, the bowl or whatever it happens to be, nice and easy. And then I like to follow that through into the bowl before I do the hook knife work. Make sure that my shoulders are relatively uniform. Apologies for the construction noise. Not a whole lot you can do about that. All right. Starting to look like a spoon, if I don't say so myself. Yeah, that's getting there. Okay, so that's my top profile looking pretty nice. I'm just going to pull the bottom up a bit, down, and then back up again, because I like making that little kick. I think it feels nice in the hand, and I think it looks kind of cool too. So just pushing that curve down. Again, working in thirds. And then once I come back to here, just bringing it back up, down, and then back up. And the good thing about once you've done this, the sides, it's quite easy to just match it and flatten things out just a little bit. And I'm not going to lie, this cherry is making my job very easy, even with the knots. It's taking these turns really nicely, because some wood doesn't. Some wood doesn't take a turn very nicely. Much softer woods, if you're carving something like poplar or willow or well, there's a lot. It depends on how green it is as well. Birch can sometimes be a bit of a pain, and it just doesn't want to turn as easily, whereas cherry can often be quite forgiving to these turns, to a point where I can almost knife finish this completely, even though this was literally cut down less than 3 hours ago, which is pretty amazing, pretty astounding to be able to work with something that was a living thing. You know, it was going to be firewood or put in the chipper, so I'm deeply, deeply honored to be able to do this kind of work. Not to say that firewood isn't a very important material as well, don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong at all. Okay, we're starting to tighten things up. Now, what I will do, starting to feel pretty good about this. And I do quite a lot of knife work, Sloyd knife work, before I get to my hook knife, especially on eating spoons. And the main reason behind that is it is far too easy to get too deep on an eating spoon. And I think an eating spoon doesn't need to be very deep. Doesn't need a massive amount of crank. This might be a controversial or at least divisive statement, but I think eating spoons need to have just enough crank to sit in the hand and to lift up into your mouth. I think past that, it becomes uncomfortable. So what I like to do is I like to make as much shaping of the spoon on the underside and top side, so that when I get to the carving of the bowl, A, I just don't have that much material to move, so it's much easier on the tools, and B, I'm not tempted to get right in there and dig too deep. I mean, you know, if you're doing a soup spoon or if it's something that someone specifically wants as an extra deep spoon, that's a different thing. But personally, I am a pretty big fan of saving that stuff until the back end. Okay, we're starting to get there. And this top is still feeling a little hairy. Yeah, I think I might need to shorten it up just a little bit so that it feels symmetrical. I hope this all finds you well and that you're taking some time for yourself. And it's a real pleasure and truly it's an honor to have you here. So thank you. Just got quite sunny. I'm just going to check to make sure that you can still see what I'm doing. Okay. So that is about at the point where I will bring in the hook knife. Maybe I'll lift up this bottom section just a little bit, just to create some movement. But sometimes it is nice to go back through after the hook knife so that you can see what you need to do. And at this point, I actually don't really need to use my large hook knife at all. That's overkill for this size. So I will just use my slightly smaller one, because I'm almost just finishing everything right now, which is crazy because it's so green. And yet here we are. Okay. So I tend to work from nose back into the lowest point, and then I flip it, and then back, and then I carve across if I need to. There we go. So you can see I'm getting to a point where that's the lowest section of the bowl. Sometimes I'll just twist around and carve that out. I hope you can see this. I'm sure you can. Oh. Then it's just a matter of, once you've created these deeper cuts, it's smoothing it out, smoothing everything out, and making sure that it's consistent. And there are lots of schools of thought with carving down the grain and across the grain. I think it will often change depending on the spoon. So don't be afraid to try both. You might find that carving right across the grain is a lot easier, and so that's what you should do. I'm starting to take some shape because I want this bowl to be as wide as possible. I'm just pulling out the edges just a little bit. Okay. One tip that I would give to people who are starting off is, when you're working on hook knife work, start as shallow as you possibly can and then work your way in. Because what everyone invariably does, and I did the same, everyone does it, is you get a hook knife in your hand and you assume that you can take these massive gouges out, and what you end up doing is you get your tool stuck, you push a little bit harder, and you either tear out or you cut yourself because you need to work the tool more than it should, more than it's designed. Hook knives really, especially these smaller hook knives, they're not built for gouging. They're built for smoothing a surface with a concave, really. I mean, I know that that's splitting hairs, but the difference between this and, say, an adze is built to gouge, and obviously something like a gouge is built to gouge. It's built to enter the wood at an extreme angle and turn out some wood. A hook knife, not so much. It's a much more finessed tool overall. It's built for those really subtle shavings. You can still do some really deep work, but when you're starting out, it's really nice to practice the shallower cuts, and it's safer. So this is starting to feel like a spoon. And I know that this might look like it's quite close to my leg, and it is, but I'm anchoring it, and I'm basically just closing my fist. I'm not dragging, I'm just closing my fist as I finish these cuts. And it's very much a controlled method. Okay. So now I'm looking at this shape of the spoon, getting an idea of the symmetry and the consistency around the front. I think it'll need a bit of work, to be honest. It's certainly not my most symmetrical work. but it has plenty of room to play, and I just need to, at this point, really, all I need to do is fine detail some things. I'm going to bring the handle in and narrow the handle for sure. That's a big thing, especially for an eating spoon. You don't want it spindly, you want it strong, but it can be a little more elegant, I think. And because I'm chatting while I'm talking about this, I'm working a little bit slower than I often would. But that's okay. So I'm looking at this and I'm seeing more on the heartwood side. So I'm going to pull the heartwood side in, and then I'm going to bring down my angles on the top of the spoon. I might start there, because if you can't really see, but it's quite high on this side. So let's flatten that, and then I can come back with the hook knife and recreate that curve easy enough. Yeah, just got to bring this edge right the way down so that it's level with the other one. That's looking better. Still a little high. Yeah, there we go. Now I'm at a point where I can really bring up the bottom of the bowl and keep using your fingers. So it's quite, there's a fair bit of density through here, so I can thin that out just a little bit. On the front, there's always a little bit more than you think, until you snap the nose off your spoon. But quite often people leave that front just a little thicker than it needs to be, which isn't the worst idea for strength. There's a middle ground, there's a balance to be met, as with everything in this craft. You're finding a difference between, elegance and usability for myself, especially because I want all of my work to be used. I don't want it to sit on a shelf. I want you to pick it up every day and scrape a bowl with it. That's what makes me happiest, knowing that they're getting used. Okay. So that knot is still coming back to haunt me just a little bit, but I think we're going to be okay. Yeah, it's starting to come together. Cool. Okay, so like I mentioned, I want to bring in the handle to one side a decent bit more. I'll just get some light on it. And this is where the wood grain can really throw your eye, so you've got to be pretty mindful of what you're getting yourself into. Sometimes it's good to kind of squint your eyes a little bit and ignore the grain and just look at the silhouette. There we go. Okay, so that is about as thin as I would like to get. Now it's just a matter of making sure both sides line up, pulling in the shoulders a little bit. And it's certainly starting to feel a little more elegant. I don't like to use the term delicate because that, to me, makes it sound like it's weak, which this is still quite a chunky spoon. I think something can be strong and elegant at the same time, which is certainly what I'm going for with an eating spoon at the very least. With all of them. Okay, softening out that curve. And you'll notice, or it's worth mentioning, that this handle is still quite square because I'm still basically just trying to make sure that my top and bottom profile is where I want it to be. Once it's at that spot that I'm happy, that's when I go back through and just round things off a little bit. Just making sure that I'm doing pretty consistent cuts. You can go back through once this is dried and do those nice long facets if you want. I might not with this one, mainly because I'm pretty happy with where it's sitting as is. Just straighten a few lines here. And then, okay, so I think now that things are kind of coming in together, I will start to chamfer my edges. I'll widen out. Obviously that still needs to be hit with the hook knife, but on the handle, I'm just going to 45 all of my edges. Maybe just bring this top down just a little bit more so it feels a little more balanced. Yeah, that's better. Okay, so let's hit these edges. And it's exactly what it sounds like. You're just putting a little rounded 45 on everything. And you can be as particular about this as you'd like. You don't need to be as particular as you need to be on a cooking spoon as with an eating spoon, because with a cooking spoon, you're being a little bit more heavy-handed. Sometimes it's nice to have a harder facet. I've found that at least. And it's just blending those facets in. Again, you don't have to. This is I don't do this with every spoon either, to be honest. This is just for this one right now because I feel like when it's going to sit in the hand, I want to make sure that it doesn't feel too angular. But sometimes that's exactly what I want. Right on. I hope YouTube doesn't get me for copyright on that. I'm not sure what the song was. But it's bumping. Okay. Back to the hook knife. Just to bring in that edge, and then we'll chamfer the spoon bowl. Oh, that's a little accent that I'm just going to put in on the handle. Again, personal preference. You don't need to do that. That feels pretty good to me. Okay, back to the hook knife. Just for finishing cuts. and final depth, because this still feels a little chunky to me. I can still thin this out just a bit. Also gives me an ability to really make sure that my finishing cuts along the bowl are where I want them to be, knowing that I have a bit of depth to play with. You're always going to get a cleaner cut going with the grain. It will always be cleaner. You're pressing down and polishing the grain, and then if you come across it, you are hitting the sides of the grain a little bit. Obviously, if your hook knife is quite sharp, you can navigate through that a little easier. But you're certainly always going to get a slightly more polished finish going with the grain. It's just a matter of once you get to that joint, quite often you need to cut across, which is that's just part of the deal. Let's see if you might not be able to see that very well. Okay, we're getting there. So the question is blending this crosscut so that it doesn't look like a crosscut. That's the tricky part, which sometimes you get it and sometimes you don't. It can also depend on the grain, how green it is. But because I tend to burnish a lot of my work, which is essentially just rubbing it with a stone or a piece of marble or a piece of glass, because I don't sand anything, the closest I come to that is burnishing, which is basically just pressing the fibers down. That center section will end up blending in and I won't need to worry about that. Okay, just push that edge out just a little more and we're on the home stretch. Using my detail knife for this last pass around the edge. Just doesn't get away from me as much. Easier for me to see, to be honest. That's a big one, is I can really see over my edge when it's this small. I'm just hitting little bits just to smooth out the top. And then chamfering all the way around the bottom, and then I'll come back and do the top. Yeah, we're getting there. And again, I'm very aware of the pace that I'm hitting right now, but to be honest, I'm just trying to make sure that you can see what I'm doing, and I don't want to rush through this for the sake of the video. Often I would do this much faster, but it's a nice sunny day and you're here with me, and so let's enjoy the time while we've got it, you know? Very nearly done. Just a little bit of chamfering on the top. If there are a couple of wiggles, those can be dealt with burnishing. Oh, that knot's coming back. And when I say that knot's coming back, what I mean is there's just still a little bit of a ripple in the grain. And you've just got to be a little more mindful of the direction that the grain is heading, just to make sure you don't dive in, because knots can throw the grain out quite aggressively. Now I'm just hitting the top, making sure it's flat, relatively flat. And then I'll just chamfer this top edge here. That means it'll sit in your hand really nicely and you won't feel any hard edges if you happen to, you know, spin things around or anything like that. And then I can just see there's one little transition on the neck. Make that a bit more pronounced on both sides. There we go. And then we'll just match that over on this side. Doesn't need much. Lovely. And I could probably faff around for an indeterminate amount of time on this, but at the end of the day, it's a spoon, isn't it? So we can't get too carried away. I didn't hit these shoulders, I just realized. There we go. Get them as uniform as I can with that knot in the way. Okay. And that there will do it. So thank you so much for watching. It was a real pleasure working through this with you, and if you like what you see, please consider subscribing and liking the videos, and again, let me know if there is something that you want to know specifically. I'd be more than happy to work on it in the next video, so leave that in the comments, and thank you again, and I hope to see you all soon.